Good morning and welcome to the San Francisco Interfaith Council's online briefing for faith leaders. In today's program, the San Francisco Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, Executive Director Shireen McSpadden presents San Francisco's Hotels to Housing Initiative. The San Francisco Interfaith Council online briefings are supported by a grant from MetaFund. Thank you. The important ongoing work of the San Francisco Interfaith Council would not be possible without generous funding from congregations, corporations, faith-based social service agencies, foundations, judicatories, and supporters like you. Help us spread the word. Visit sfinterfaithcouncil.org to learn about SFIC programming and how to become a supporter. Follow SFIC on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe to SFIC's YouTube channel to watch all of our previous virtual events. A bit of housekeeping. Today's program is being recorded. For audio and video, all participants are muted and without video to minimize distraction. To submit a question or comment, select the chat button at the bottom of your screen and send a message to Q&A. Questions will be forwarded to the presenter for their review following the program. To activate closed captions, select the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and click Enable Live Transcription. The December 30th, 2021 health order suspends the indoor universal masking exemption for stable cohorts of 100% fully vaccinated people in select settings, including workspaces, gyms, and religious gatherings, until January 31st, 2022. The update to the order brings San Francisco in alignment with the state and means that the requirements apply to everyone, regardless of their vaccination status. Anyone 12 and older will need to show proof of vaccination to go indoors in some places in San Francisco, like bars, restaurants, clubs, gyms, large indoor events, and any business or event serving food or drinks indoors. To find your vaccination record, go to myvaccinerecord.cdph.ca.gov. The vaccines are safe and effective. And now San Francisco Department of Public Health is opening up COVID-19 boosters to all adults 18 years and older. Due to the latest surge of COVID-19, workers in healthcare and high-risk settings are required to receive their COVID vaccine booster. Go to sf.gov to find a vaccine site or vaccine event in your neighborhood. Now is the time to come together, San Francisco. Together, we can stop Asian discrimination, bias, hate, and violence. The COVID-19 virus has no race or nationality. It is simply a disease. To report a hate crime, call the SFPD 415-553-1133. And at this time, I'd like to hand the floor over to the Executive Director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Michael Pappas. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Trey. Good morning. I'm Michael Pappas, and on behalf of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, I want to welcome you to this week's online briefing for faith leaders. At the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the City and County of San Francisco impressively provided for the health and safety of those living on our streets by acquiring hotels and other accommodations. Now, with an eye at recovery and a long-term solution, the city is launching a program to transition those clients from hotels to housing. This week's online briefing for faith leaders welcomes Shireen McSpadden, Executive Director of the San Francisco Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, who will present an overview of the city's response to the COVID-19 pandemic for people experiencing homelessness and long-term plans to move from crisis response to recovery, including the acquisition of new housing and the expansion of new models of temporary shelter. At this time, it's my extreme pleasure to welcome back our immediate past chair and friend and colleague Kaushik Roy to offer the interfaith statement. Kaushik and I had the unique and great privilege of serving as commissioners on the Department of Aging and Adult Services under our guest presenter today, Shireen McSpadden. So I thought it'd be wonderful to welcome Kaushik back. He is the executive director of the Shanti Project, which is providing incredible services to very vulnerable populations here in San Francisco. Welcome back, Kaushik.
Good morning, Michael. Thank you so much for inviting me back. And I never want to miss an opportunity to express my heartfelt appreciation to you and Cynthia for your ongoing leadership of the Interfaith Council and the city's interfaith community. People who've heard me here before know what I like to say, which is it's impossible for two people to do as much as the two of you do, and yet you somehow find a way to keep doing it. So truly, thank you. And I also just want to give a special thanks to our very special guest, Shireen McSpadden. She is really one of the heroines of the city's response to COVID and one of the city's most effective and modest leaders who really gets things done. And we know how packed your schedule is. So for you to be so generous with your time, Shireen, we really appreciate it to have you here. If you're joining us for the first time, at the beginning of every Interfaith Council event, we have a statement that we like to read. So I'll go ahead and do that now. This is an interfaith community. Whatever our individual belief, it can be freely expressed here with no apologies. If we are invited to offer a prayer in this setting, it should be offered according to the tradition with which we identify. If we are invited to speak on a subject from the perspective of our tradition, we are free to do so without fear of offending those who come from another tradition. We come together as people of faith to learn from each other that we might better understand the multiplicity of faith traditions in our city and in our world. Good morning.
Thank you, Kaushik. Among the many diverse constituencies that the Interfaith Council represents are what we call judicatories. And judicatories are those entities that have responsibility for giving voice to many congregations and religious institutions under their jurisdiction and from their tradition. We are very blessed to have with us today the president of the executive director of the Northern California Board of Rabbis, Rabbi Jill Zimmerman, who has graciously accepted our invitation to be here today. We thought it most appropriate in light of the hostage taking at congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, Texas, that she be with us. We want to welcome you, Rabbi Jill, because you are not only the executive director of the Northern California Board of Rabbis, but you are here in your debut role, and because you just began in this position, and we want to welcome you as part of our interfaith family here in San Francisco. So with that, I turn the floor over to you and invite you to offer our reflective moment.
Great, thank you, Michael. I am just so honored to be here. As Michael said, I am new to my position. I'm in the second month, and we just actually moved here in June. You know, in the midst of the rise of anti-Semitism in this country and actually around the world, there has never before, at least in the United States, been a hostage taking. And I want to share with you a couple thoughts about what happened on Saturday. So among my fellow Jewish clergy, there were two things going on Saturday. Number one, you know, many of us who are not on social media on Shabbat started getting messages, and immediately what happened is that people were offering prayers and psalms, beseeching God for the hostages to be rescued or released. There's just a whole plethora, as you know, of prayers, especially psalms, for rescue from danger. And it gave new meaning to one of the prayers that we say daily in the morning, which is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam matir asurim, which is, we say, blessed is the one who frees the captives. And we say that every morning, and often it's, you know, not something we think about a lot, but on Saturday, it had new meaning. And so as soon as the hostages came out of that situation, My Facebook wall and Twitter was filled with that prayer. Blessed is the one who frees the captives. The other thing that was going on Saturday, on Shabbat, is that colleagues were holding each other up. Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker happened to be ordained from the seminary I was ordained from, Hebrew Union College. And my entire Facebook wall was filled with people who are calling, texting, gathering. It was like an online community of people all across the country and in fact the world. On Sunday, we received, the Jewish community received this lovely statement of both support and also outrage from Michael Pappas and the San Francisco Interfaith Council, and it just brought tears to my eyes. I cannot tell you how important your support is to us as Jewish clergy. And then Monday at the interfaith service in honor of Martin Luther King, which I attended, it was again so moving to hear the words of many of the speakers mention the situation in Colleyville, Texas. I cannot tell you how vital your support is to us. I wanted just to share with you that a story from the Talmud that came to me in thinking about this kind of support and our connection to each other across faiths. There's a story in the Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan, who was a noted healer. He was just had this ability, went around just healing people. And what he would do is someone was sick and he would go and sit with them and he would say, give me your hand. And then they would be raised up and healed. Well, Rabbi Yochanan himself became ill, and Rabbi Hanina, another rabbi, came to him and said to Rabbi Yochanan, give me your hand. And so Rabbi Yochanan gave him his hand and Rabbi Hanina raised him up. And the Talmud asked the question, why could not, if Rabbi Yochanan was such an amazing healer, why could Rabbi Yochanan not raise himself, not heal himself? And they replied, the prisoner cannot free himself from jail. That story just talks about how essential our support of each other, that we need each other when we ourselves are in trouble, in distress. And I can just say, I mean, even all these days later, the Jewish community is still in shock. I mean, one of the things that we're doing is exploring, people all over exploring security options. And so that's one thing. But the other thing, which is as tangible, I would say, is us as different faiths reaching out to each other. And so I'm just here to say thank you again, and I look forward to continued conversations and relationships, which is what we in the Board of Rabbis are all about right now. So thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Jill. Very powerful words. And know that we are always here for one another, and we welcome you to San Francisco, and we look forward to further engagement. God bless you.
Thank you.
We are very privileged to have with us today Shireen McSpadden, who is no stranger to the work of the San Francisco Interfaith Council. She distinguishes herself because in terms of our constituencies, she is one of us. She is the daughter of a pastor. And so in her role previously as the director of Disabilities and Aging Services, she worked very closely with us to engage communities of faith, to get a sense from the faith leaders what they were seeing, and to make sure that they had access to services for that constituency. She is now in a very challenging position, but one I know that she is rising to the occasion a year after being appointed by Mayor Breed in directing the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing. Our organization emerged from a homeless crisis over 30 years ago, and so we have the privilege of working with Shireen, both as hosts of the Interfaith Winter Shelter, as well as convening the faith-based social service agencies. And I was so pleased, Shireen, to see attending today so many of the CEOs, as well as others who you work very closely with in the more secular world. We welcome you. Today's program is critical, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you to support you so that our city can be a model for the nation in terms of its response.
Thank you, Michael. And I just want to thank Rabbi Zimmerman for opening up with those words. That was really helpful context setting, I think, for us, and kind of centers us all as we enter into this conversation. And I also want to echo what Kaushik said, which Michael and Cynthia, you do an amazing job for an office of two. And I've had the pleasure of working with both of you for many years, and it's great to be back. I also noticed that there are a number of my colleagues in the nonprofit sector in the homelessness response system here, and I just want to say hello and good morning to you. And I see some former colleagues from my old position, as well as some United Methodist colleagues as well. So I just want to say that I feel very welcome in this environment, and I'm excited to be talking with you today. So Trey, I know you're going to show the slides. Thank you so much. And we'll get started. So Michael asked me to come today to talk about what he called from hotels to homes, which I liked that framing, and so we kept that title. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, give a little bit of background, and then talk about what the city's response to COVID was, and how we built up the shelter-in-place hotel system, and now how we're moving people from those hotels into permanent homes. So next slide. So just to give a little bit of background of the department for people who don't know, the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing was formed by former Mayor Ed Lee in 2016. And the point was to create a centralized department to address homelessness. The majority of the programs that were consolidated into this department came from two places, the Human Services Agency and the Department of Public Health. And our mission is to strive to make homelessness rare, brief, and one time through the provision of coordinated high-quality services, the majority of which we contract to nonprofit service providers to provide. So our partnership with the nonprofit sector is extremely, extremely important. That is 99% of what we do at our department. Our core values are compassion, courage, common sense, and equity. And implementing our work requires really, really strong collaborative relationships, learning, and adaptation. And, we're here talking about people and talking about the best interventions to break those chains that Rabbi Zimmerman talked about this morning. I mean, we have to always remember that we're talking about people who've been through trauma, who've really had challenges. We're dealing with systemic poverty and racism. And so it means that we need to be particularly sensitive to the people we're serving. We serve approximately 14,000 people on a nightly basis, and that includes over 10,000 households and more than 8,000 permanent supportive housing units. Next slide. So in thinking about how we balance the COVID response and ongoing operations, or how we continue to, throughout the pandemic, we have maintained our core work in partnership with our providers, but we've also had to massively shift our work in response to the pandemic, primarily by reducing capacity in our shelter system, which, really we generally have congregate shelters. And obviously during COVID, that became a very challenging model and an unsafe one. And so we moved from that and reduced capacity in those shelters and opened up a number of shelter-in-place hotels and other alternative shelters in our system. So that has been a key focus in this last year and a half, almost 2 years now. Our second focus has really been to strengthen our commitment to equity and our response to the overwhelming disproportionality in both homelessness and COVID-19. And then to continue the operations in core and essential programs that we use to shelter more than 14,000 people every day. So just to go back to the focus on equity, one of the things that we did during COVID was to publish our first racial equity plan. And we also have recently hired our first chief equity officer. That's Anthony Bush, who started with us on November 29th. And we're really, really excited to have him, both because we need to be focusing internally on equity amongst our staff. We also need to be focusing externally on ensuring that we're chipping away at the disproportionality, which means that homelessness more often affects Black and brown people than anyone else, and particularly Black people. And then also look at the pipeline in our system and the job opportunities and things like that to ensure that we are really creating a pipeline that people who have experienced homelessness, people who are Black and brown, can move up through and be part of our homelessness response system. Next slide. So in the mayor's, in July 2020, Mayor Breed announced her homelessness recovery plan that provides the strategic and policy direction to the department over the next couple of years. And it expands our system to support our most vulnerable residents as we begin to move from response in COVID to recovery. And the plan includes both expansive housing resources, including the largest expansion of permanent supportive housing in 20 years, to support housing placement efforts of our guests who are currently in our shelter-in-place hotels and across our system in general. And it also expands resources to support those who are on the streets or at risk of becoming homeless, including expanding targeted homeless prevention and reactivating congregate shelters to the extent that is safe. The plan also includes maintaining new temporary resources that we managed under the COVID Command Center's alternative shelter program, specifically the 120 shelter-in-place RV trailers that are serving the Bayview Hunters Point community. Next slide. So just to give you an overview of our shelter-in-place hotels, we like to have acronyms for everything, and I'm trying not to use them this morning. We call them the SIP hotels as well. But as part of the city's alternative shelter program that we stood up in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the city opened 25 shelter-in-place, or what we also call non-congregate shelter sites, to support COVID vulnerable people experiencing homelessness. And COVID vulnerable people, if you recall, were older people and people with specific underlying health conditions. Since the program's opening, the shelter-in-place hotel program has served over 3,700 guests. Over 500 were COVID vulnerable guests who were transitioned out of congregate shelters during the first months of the pandemic. At its highest capacity, the 25 shelter-in-place hotels provided over 2,200 hotel rooms, or 19% of the state's non-congregate shelter rooms opened under Project Roomkey. And I really like that stat because San Francisco has about 5% of the state's homeless population, and yet we were 19% of the state's non-congregate shelter rooms. So that means our partners and our department just really worked hard and aggressively to make sure that we could house as many people in this program as possible. The city committed to housing guests in long-term housing as we wind down the shelter-in-place hotel rooms program. And as of January 2022, we have housed 915 guests into permanent homes. The department continues to work with the shelter-in-place guests and service providers to house as many guests as possible into permanent housing. We understand that housing is healthcare. We have heard so many stories from people who were in these hotels about how important it was and meaningful for them to be in their own room with their own bathroom, with meals. I mean, things that we were not able to offer in the same way in the congregate shelter. And I've talked to a couple of people who had experienced homeless, who had been in shelters before, who said, I could concentrate in this room. It's so different from what it was like to be in a congregate shelter where it's chaotic and it's really hard when you've experienced the things that people have experienced on the street, they've experienced in life, and to be in a chaotic situation when you're trying to actually get yourself healthy and focus on work or focus on school or any of the other things that people need to do to move forward, things like sobriety and all of that. So it's really exciting that we're continuing to, as we demobilize this program, that we're able to move people into permanent homes. So next slide. So this is the demographics of the shelter-in-place hotel program. As I said, there were over 3,700 guests served through the program since April 2020. And these guests reflect a wide range of diversity and equitable access to the program. And they really reflect the growing need for resources to support older adults experiencing homelessness, who are particularly susceptible to the virus. So 45% of our guests were above the age of 55. And that's partly because we were really focused on people who are most COVID vulnerable, but the fastest growing population of people experiencing homelessness who are adults in the adult system are older adults over the age of 55. 39% were Black or African American, and that reflects what we know about the larger population of homeless people. Black or African American people represent about 40% of our total population of people experiencing homelessness. 18% were Hispanic or Latinx. 62% male, 2% identified as trans female, and 1% gender nonconforming. And then 10% identified as LGBTQ+. So again, I'm saying this to say that this program really reflected what we know about the overall homeless population in San Francisco. So the next slide is services offered at SIP hotels. The SIP hotel program offered an opportunity for city and nonprofit partners to coordinate on a wide range of services. So those included wellness checks and COVID-informed health screenings, harm reduction services, in-home supportive services and nursing support services, which were especially needed with the 45% of the guests who were over the age of 55. Referrals and linkages to coordinated entry access points and public benefit programs like CalWorks and CalFresh. We have a really strong partnership with the Human Services Agency. Exit planning for permanent exits from homelessness through the shelter-in-place rehousing. Laundry and janitorial services, meals, and then security and de-escalation by having 24/7 on-site staff throughout our nonprofit provider operators. Next slide. So as we wind down the SIP hotels, one of our strategies to support the housing effort is to acquire hotels and other residential buildings that can quickly be converted into permanent supportive housing. A lot of the hotels, the hotel industry has really suffered in San Francisco. And so we've had hotels who are very motivated to work with us, to work with the city, and to convert either former SIP hotels or even new hotels into permanent housing. So we've been kind of going through these hotels. We put out a solicitation broadly to hotels across the city and got a whole bunch of responses. I think it was over 80 responses. Not all those hotels will make great permanent housing. Even some of our SIP hotels won't make great permanent housing. So we're not limiting ourselves to those. but we really are going through and assessing the strengths and weaknesses of the spate of hotels that we got in this solicitation effort. So not only do we have the urgency of need driving our acquisition, but also a unique confluence of funds from HomeKey at the state level. The HomeKey program you may have read about, which is state and federal funding for purchase of hotels. And then we have our Proposition C locally. And those two things together make it possible for us to add significant new housing through this acquisition strategy. The mayor's homeless recovery plan set a goal of leasing or acquiring 1,500 new units, as I mentioned earlier, and we're on track to achieve this goal. Next slide. So the city has hired dedicated staff and has built a team to lead the work of acquisition. This group is operating under the principles of acquisition of shelter-in-place hotels to support the rehousing and demobilization effort. So again, where we can use hotels that have been SIP hotels, it's a much quicker transfer to the new program. Acquiring also non-SIP buildings to provide the best possible housing options for people experiencing homelessness, leveraging all available local, state, and federal resources, and we've been really aggressive in that. And then to move as quickly as possible to acquire and open new housing. And the populations that we are focusing on with these are families with children, transitional age youth, and then adults. And when we think about adults, I personally am also thinking about the needs of older adults as sometimes being separate from the rest of the adult population. And then our acquisition priorities. So through our own experiences with funding permanent supportive housing and input from our providers and our tenants, we have developed a list of attributes and amenities that we look for in all of these buildings. And those include the building condition. We want to use the money to purchase buildings and not to go into extensive rehab. We're also looking at maximum accessibility because we know that people, the majority of people are going to experience disability at some point in life, and it's really important to have accessibility. Accommodate a diverse set of program needs for different populations. And that's, again, adults, transitional age youth, families, or older adults. Private bathrooms, I think that's obvious. Have or can accommodate in-unit kitchenettes, geographic diversity, and then scale of property matches the program needs while maximizing operating efficiency. And then for non-SIP properties, we're looking at low current occupancy so that we can really move as many people from SIP hotels into those sites. And we're also looking for potential for longer term redevelopment, such as large motel sites, which down the road could be turned into affordable housing. So this is our new acquisition and lease map. And I know for me, it's actually really hard to read this slide. But hopefully you can see that we are working on sites across the city. And one of our, I mentioned geographic diversity, but we really are trying to look for hotels in every community. And, part of the challenge of that is there are more hotels in the central part of the city and Soma, Mission, than there are in the outer parts of the city. And so we look at other strategies sometimes for those neighborhoods, but we are trying our best to think about purchasing hotels in all parts of the city. Next, next slide. So toward the mayor's homeless recovery plan, the city has approved the acquisition of 5 buildings. 3 have been purchased already and 2 are in process. So the Diva and the Granada and the Eula were actually purchased. 2 of those are in the Lower Nob Hill, kind of Upper Tenderloin area. The Eula is in the Mission. And then we have the Panoramic and the Mission Inn, which are in process. And one of those is in Soma, and the other is in Outer Mission. And then we've master leased 2 buildings, the Post Hotel and the Artmar Hotel. We've activated more than 400 units of flexible housing subsidy pool units, which allow us to really think broadly and citywide. We have 1 new master lease project at 5050 Farrell in process, which is the Garland Hotel. And we have acquired, or actually we have a proposed acquisition of 835 Turk Street in District 5, which is the Gotham Hotel. So we're continuing to look for more across the city and really welcome people's suggestions on that. So the next slide, we know COVID's not going away. We really are rethinking shelter and trying to learn from our success of the shelter-in-place hotel program. This is a conversation that's going on across the country. We're understanding that congregate shelter is going to be a challenging model for many years to come, particularly because of COVID. But we've also learned, and I think knew in many ways before, that people prefer different types of shelter, and congregate shelter, as I mentioned earlier, is challenging, even in the best of situations. Different neighborhoods have different challenges and different infrastructure, and different models are really needed to meet neighborhood needs. So as I mentioned before, downtown and kind of the central part of the city has hotels. The outer neighborhoods have more parking lots. We know in many of those outer neighborhoods, we have vehicular homelessness, which has really grown. And we need to think about different interventions for those neighborhoods and ways to support people. If they have to live in their car while we're working with them on permanent homes, then we need to be able to provide them services and safety in areas. We've also learned from Safe Sleep that, by bringing people into an area where, that's fenced in and safe, and we can provide services for them, showers and bathrooms and things like that, that it's just a much more humane situation. And, again, people, when they're not worried about their safety all night long, can get a much better night's sleep. And that helps them be on the path to really thinking about what they need to do as next steps. And so we're rethinking all of this right now. And also, we have a budget that we have to work within, but we're very interested in continuing to rethink what these shelter models should look like. And, one of the other things that I just wanted to mention real quickly is we're also looking for the first time at having small cabins, or kind of the tiny homes. We're going to be opening up a new site at 33 Goff, and we'll really get to see how that works within the context of our city. It's something that's being done in other places. You've probably noticed in Oakland, there are a number of those now. And so we're also looking at that as a possible new model for San Francisco. So the next slide talks about challenges and support. This work is really complicated and fast moving. One of the things that I learned when I first, or one of the things I think I heard from my staff in particular, and also from the community when I first started, is that we start one thing and then we, something happens and we have to quickly pivot. Of course, COVID has made that even more challenging than just the work about addressing homelessness. And so we're always moving and always rethinking. One of the major areas of challenge, and one where I think the faith community can really help, is really advocating with us on community acceptance of proposed projects. I have been in a number of meetings with community members as we've really worked to try to get the community to accept some of the new sites that we have. And I have to admit, for me, it's been really disheartening to hear some of the comments that people make and some of the myths that people hold. And, I think the faith communities, and this is where I can say what, I guess echo what Michael said earlier. I grew up in a faith community. My father was a minister. And one of the first things that I was told is that we take care of each other. I mean, it's a basic tenet pretty much every religion. And yet we go into these meetings and I actually don't even recognize fellow San Franciscans in some of these meetings. It's really disheartening to me. And so I think one way that faith communities could really help is join in some of these meetings, but also really think about how your communities work with your constituents to help us change this narrative. Everywhere I go, I hear people say, oh, this is really important what you're doing, and we're not NIMBYs, but this is not the right community. We have children living here. We have seniors living here. We have, people who are vulnerable. And, that's the same population that we're trying to serve right here. We are serving older people. We're serving children. We're serving transitional age youth. And, we are all San Franciscans. And so to the extent that you can work with us on that, I think that's one of the most valuable things that faith communities can do in partnership with us on this work. We are committed to being a good neighbor and working with our host communities to ensure that our programs can integrate well and support ongoing neighborhood vitality. And we really are, and we really want to work with all of you on how we make that happen. And then I think the very concrete ways that we can work together is we would love to work with you to organize your communities to support new projects that we have coming up. And then look at your own community assets that can be used to address the homelessness crisis. Thinking about parking lots for cabins or buildings for shelter. Also, a number of faith communities have sites for new housing development. And we have a small group that we're working with through Michael and through Dr. Butler with the African American Faith-Based Coalition, but would love to hear ideas about how we could partner on building new assets into the homelessness response system. And I believe that is my final slide. So I'm happy. I guess the format is that it's gonna go back to Michael, and then you're gonna ask some questions, correct?
Remarkable and comprehensive. That's how I would really define what you just said. Thank you. And you gave us a lot for us to think about as well. You came into this position, Shireen, at the beginning of the pandemic, if memory serves correctly, and I don't think you'd been in the position more than 2 weeks before you met with our faith-based social service agency CEO roundtable. A lot of our nonprofits and social service agencies, they have their own challenges in the midst of the pandemic, fundraising and retaining and recruiting staff and the like. If you were to look into a crystal ball as you're rethinking shelter models, what would you say to these nonprofit leaders of how they should be thinking in terms of working with the city as you're rethinking shelter models?
Well, I mean, so are you talking about all of our nonprofits or the specifically faith-based nonprofits or everybody, correct?
Look at who's on the line today.
Okay.
I'm trying to lift up their voice.
One of the things, so I've been really delighted to work with the nonprofit partners that we have. And I knew some of them before I started this role, and many of them I did not. And I'm just incredibly impressed with the ingenuity and the hard work. I mean, it's been really difficult for nonprofits during the past couple of years, for sure. And I think, I feel like we need to hear from our community partners. And I've said that we have a number of different ways that people can engage, and we're just launching our new strategic plan. But I feel like our nonprofit partners are on the ground and are hearing from people experiencing homelessness, and we have more to learn from them often than we can actually tell them. So I'm, very much in listening mode and wanting to hear from our nonprofit partners what they think works best. And I've been hearing that, and and we have a lot to do. We have a lot of things that we can do immediately. We have funding challenges. Nonprofits really have issues around wage equity. We steal people from the nonprofit sector all the time in city government because we have better benefits and wages, and we have to work on some sort of equity with that. But I really want to hear everybody's ideas and think about how we can use the dollars we have in the most responsible way and continue serving more and more people. So I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but I feel like we need to hear from the nonprofits every bit as much as we're here to direct the work that they do.
Yeah, it seems to me too that the nonprofits you worked with, so many of them, especially the social service agencies, in your previous role, you're working with as well now. So you know these folk and the relationships are there. The thing that impressed me about your presentation was looking at the constituencies who are vulnerable and experiencing homelessness through that prism, also of those who are aging on the streets. We've run a shelter for over 3 decades, and when I look at the demographics, the greater number really are aging adults on the streets. Can you just kind of recap what you feel their greatest needs are and how the department is addressing them?
Sure. I mean, I think 2 things. Older adults have challenges on the streets, obviously. I mean, we know from the work of Dr. Margot Kuchel, for instance, that people who are 50 represent, as people who are 70 or 80, because it's so hard. Living on the street is hard. It's hard for young people. It's hard for children. It's hard for older people. But people age much more quickly and show more comorbidities when they're 50 and older. And so, and not only is that awful for those people, it's also very expensive in our healthcare system. So it's really incumbent upon us to find a better way to serve them. I think, the same thing happens in shelter. As the former department head of the Department of Disability and Aging, we would see a number of older adults come in from shelters who'd been abused in the shelter system because, they didn't have the defenses that they need to have. There was financial abuse, there was physical abuse. Often older people in shelter end up in an acute hospital setting, and the hospital feels uncomfortable discharging them back out to shelter because it can be a death sentence for some people. And so definitely need to figure that out. And we have been working both with our shelter providers, with the Department of Disability and Aging Services, to really look at how we might segment an older population to better serve them. We have some providers who are very interested in doing that. In addition to that, it's also challenging in permanent supportive housing as people age, and this happens everywhere. It happens in the larger community, but just given the sheer numbers of older people in our community, often people in permanent supportive housing have issues like dementia and other things. And so we know that they often fail in permanent supportive housing. So we're looking at what kinds of supports we can put into permanent supportive housing. Obviously, in-home supportive services is very important, but there are other things that we can do in partnership with the Department of Aging and organizations like Unlock and IOA to ensure that people have support and that they can live in that housing as long as possible without having to move into skilled nursing or assisted living.
I guess one of the elephants in the room also is the issue of mental health needs and substance abuse. And the fact that so many people are dying of fentanyl overdoses. Would you like to address that issue in some way and how the department is looking at that?
Yeah, so that's really our partnership with the Department of Public Health. The Department of Public Health has a new director of behavioral health services, and she and Dr. Colfax, who is, of course, the head of Department of Public Health, their exec team and our exec team meet monthly. And we're really talking about how we can partner on those issues because they are the lead in treatment. They're the lead in mental health SF and rolling that program out. And yet they know, of course, we need to work together to ensure that any of the mental health services that get rolled out to our population, whether it's people on the street, in shelter, or in permanent housing. And so we're just starting that because, we've started meeting for a couple of months. We're going to be working with UCSF as well and having them help us frame this conversation and think about what metrics we need to collect together and what kind of interventions we can work on together. But we're definitely in conversation. And as you know, we, under the leadership of the Department of Emergency Management, a couple days ago, launched the Tenderloin Linkage Center. And that's really a partnership with Department of Emergency Management, our department, and the Department of Public Health. And so it's a chance for us to try out this, homelessness, engagement, housing access, mental health treatment access, and, just general health access all at once. And so I'm really excited to see what comes out of that. And we've had really good engagement from the community. We've had people coming in. I was down there yesterday, and I think we were at 120 yesterday for people we were serving, and it was bustling. And so, there are a number of ways we can work together, but I think the more that we do things like this, the better our relationship is, and the more coordinated we are, which I have to say, as somebody who's been working for the city for 19 years, can be a challenge across departments. So I'm very excited about that partnership.
In addition to the project-based programs discussed, what is the role of rental subsidies in addressing the crisis?
So rental subsidies are really important because, and we have a variety of programs that provide rental subsidies in San Francisco, led by different departments. But, what that really does is it allows people to, sometimes with help and sometimes find on their own, either find their own housing. And if they can't afford the full rent, then the subsidy helps them to make the difference between what they can pay and what the rent is. But we also have housing locator services that go along with some of those programs. So if people are not able to find their own housing, and there are a variety of reasons that people can't, then we're really able, through our nonprofit partners, to help them find that housing. And so there's a couple different advantages to that. People can choose what neighborhood they want to be in. And, despite all the myths about people flooding San Francisco from other places, we know that the majority of people experiencing homelessness are actually displaced in San Francisco, many of them in the neighborhoods they live in, because they want to be near their communities, right? And so this allows them to kind of choose the neighborhood. And it also, again, gets back to our geographic diversity goal, because, as I mentioned, hotels tend to be centered in certain parts of the city. And yet, that we have all this flat housing stock, in neighborhoods like the Sunset and the Richmond and Bayview, where there's just not that same kind of multi-unit opportunity. And so it really helps us meet that goal as well.
When we began our Interfaith Essential Housing Task Force back in 2014, one of our challenges, and I look and I think about the words of Reverend John Burens from the First Unitarian Universalist Churches, as we are seeking to repurpose properties to create affordable housing, to meet the need of the city, we also need to develop a narrative as housing as a human right. And I think that there's a prophetic voice and a moral voice that the faith community can offer. I look at, you're talking about diversity in a map. I look at a map, and if we were to take your acquisition map and superimpose them, we have 800 dots on our map in San Francisco. So we're in every neighborhood. Talk about geographic diversity. How do you see us being able to take that narrative of housing as a human right and the morality of housing as a human right, and assisting you in your quest to make sure that everybody is housed in San Francisco?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I mentioned earlier, but I can maybe expand on a little bit more, is advocacy. And I think just very, very specifically, it would be super helpful to have faith communities in or houses of faith in specific neighborhoods really join some of these community meetings that we hold to give a different perspective. Because, often we have, the dynamic I've seen is often we have people in a community who are there to speak out against it. We often have a few people who are in the community to speak out for it. And then we have a number of advocates from our system who are very important voices, but, we need more people from those communities to say, actually, we welcome this in. And I think that would be extremely helpful. I also think it would be helpful, and this is from my own experience of faith communities as learning organizations, but they're like you're doing today. I mean, there are a number of ways that faith communities can hold community conversations, whether it's a salon or whether it's a series, to really talk about what it means to care for other human beings and what it means to not other homeless people or people experiencing mental illness or drug use disorder. I mean, I think there are just so many ways we can kind of recenter ourselves as San Franciscans. And I think faith communities can play a huge role in that and can do it individually as well as collectively, like you're doing today. I think also, as I said, if we really are very open, we need to be very aggressive in thinking about, what it would mean to house as many people as we can. I mean, we are often short on resources, as everybody gets very excited about the budget that we have, but, homelessness didn't come, you mentioned 30 years. It's been with us, and it's been growing and growing. And so, it's not surprising that we're going to have to spend a lot of money to turn the tide. And so having ideas from faith communities about lots or sites for affordable housing, any of those, we're really looking to hear from you about, what's available. And because there are 800 houses of worship in San Francisco, there's got to be some opportunity there.
And we look forward to working with you on that, Shireen. We've had a number of questions in the chat that we didn't get a chance to address. I will forward them to you so that you can take a look. Great food for thought and respond as you're able to. One thing I just would, in closing, because we are at the hour, is, it's in the DNA of communities of faith to respond to homelessness. And I think that the more we engage people to come and maybe directly engage with the clients, the more we can help win hearts and souls for the greater good and the greater cause. And I know that we are a city of bold ideas. And so I would plant that seed today as you look forward, because I think that we can be good advocates, and we can also help bring people to that sensitivity. And so consider us partners in this endeavor and this effort with you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, for your comprehensive presentation, for the heart that you've brought to this programming. And we look forward to a continued conversation. We also thank Rabbi Jill Zimmerman and Kaushik as well, and look forward to seeing everybody next week. Next week, we have a very interesting program. We are going to be welcoming San Francisco Police Department Financial Crimes and Special Victims Unit, Sergeant Alan Mulligan, who's going to present on financial scams that prey upon vulnerable sectors. So we look forward to seeing everybody this time next week. And God bless you and God keep you.